All right, welcome everyone today to our economic forecast luncheon. This is really the premier economic forecast event of Northern Utah, and we're so excited to have you here. I'm Brandon Hansen, I'm the president of Bank of Utah. We hope you find this event informative and helpful. Bank of Utah really enjoys bringing you these events, and we're doing that this year in partnership with the Ogden Weber Chamber of Commerce and Weber State University Goddard School of Business. Today we have an impressive lineup of presenters. Their full bios are in the program, and I will be introducing them in a minute. But at this time, I would like to turn things over to Chuck Lenhart, President and CEO of Ogden Weber Chamber of Commerce, and Eric Smith from the Goddard School of Business.
Thanks so much, Brandon. Hey, this is spectacular. We just are so excited for this day. This is one of the events that we look forward to as chamber to come together, and it's really just it's a good time to see where we've come from, where we're headed in the future, and this vision really about this event has been in the works for many years, and it's grown and grown and grown to the point where it is now. And to have over 300 people attend this event from our community is amazing. Now, I'll have you remember 2 years ago, we almost had this number of people here, and we were in the Monarch, and 2 weeks later, COVID hit. This is not a forecast. But thank you guys for coming. I would just like to just recognize a person who has worked really hard for us this year, and who behind the scenes for the Chamber of Commerce, and that's Mark Adams. Mark, are you here? Where are you at, Mark? Right there. Mark, let's give Mark a round of applause. So, Mark and our officers, Mark is our chamber chair this year. And we have so many great leaders of our chamber, and all of you that are chamber members, thank you for coming out. We just look forward to a great event. So thanks, Brandon.
This is an impressive site, and it's really a pleasure to be co-sponsoring this with the Bank of Utah and the Ogden Weber Chamber of Commerce. And as I extend welcome from the Goddard School of Business and Economics, I want to do so with a note of appreciation and an invitation. First of all, the note of appreciation is thank you. I don't have an opportunity, and members of the Goddard School don't have an opportunity very often to speak to a group like this and say thank you, because you are the people who are hiring our graduates, and I consider it to be a partnership. We're working hopefully with you to give you the students and the employees that you need. That happens through participation on advisory boards, for which I thank you. You're adjuncting for us and injecting some real world experience into the classroom, which is appreciated and needed for our students. Your financial support, and otherwise engaging with any of us at the Goddard School. And in that regard, I hope that we can have a stronger connection, and that members of the Goddard School, apart from just me as Associate Dean, will be here in the future and connecting with you. And I'd also like to extend an invitation to you. As those of you who are graduates of Weber State and particularly the Goddard School know, in connection with your degree, regardless of what it is, in terms of major, you take a course called the NI Lecture Series. And in that course, you experience a variety of perspectives of business as you all come and provide about a 50-minute lecture. And we need you. So if you have interest in coming in and participating and presenting in that type of setting, please reach out to me. I would love to have that conversation, and I'll refer you to Brett Merrill, our career services liaison, and he'll be able to coordinate with you in that regard. Otherwise, again, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate that. Well, to start things off, we have Michael Jeanfreau. He's a senior economist at the Utah Department of Workforce Services. He has a joint bachelor degree in financial math and quantitative economics. Mr. Jeanfreau provides fact-based and data-driven information to decision makers so they can make informed choices. He, along with his team of economists at the Utah Department of Workforce Services, provides data, analysis, and forecasts on key economic indicators related to employment in Utah. When Michael's not immersed in synthesizing data into mental maps, he runs a Dungeons and Dragons group and enjoys beekeeping in the Beehive State. We've had Michael present at past events, and his information is informative, it's creative, and is unique as a personality. Please join me in welcoming Michael Jeanfreau.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Jeanfreau. We should have a presentation in just a second. Thanks for having me here. Bank of Utah, thanks for having me back again. And I'm a graduate of the Goddard School of Business and Economics. All right, here we go. So we're going to go through a couple things in Northern Utah and talk a little bit about the future. Hard to know, but we're going to do quick facts, kind of catch up. We've had a couple years from the pandemic and things have, by and large, kind of recovered to where they were. We're going to talk about some of the current pressures. At DWS, obviously, we focus on labor. We care a lot about the workforce in Utah. And so we're going to look at that kind of as the lens of analysis for what's been going on in the last few years in the labor market. And then we're going to look at some of the stuff that's going to affect us long term, which we've talked about before. So I'll try and keep it a little short. So where are we at? Our employment now at the beginning of this year is above what we were before COVID. So we have recovered in all of the, in all of our different industries. You can see on the right here is a chart of employment through time. We have that big dip on the green line for April 2020 where we had that big downturn. But since then, actually by the end of 2020, we have recovered just in pure employment numbers. And you can see in growth rates year over, we're doing really well. We've got a 5% growth rate right now, which is really impressive. So across the state, you can see this is a breakdown of job gains over the last 2 years, that time period I talked about from right before COVID till now, and where we've seen job gains. And so like leisure and hospitality, for example, one of the hardest hit is still just breaking even, but we've seen a lot of gains in trade, transport, utility, in manufacturing, in construction, in professional business services. So the impact across different industries obviously was a little bit different, and we see that still playing out. In Northern Utah, this is just Northern Utah instead of the entire state. You really see the emphasis on manufacturing, really is the backbone of a lot of what we do up here. And we've seen wage gains there in trade, transport, and construction on the big ones. The joke is construction never slows down in Utah. That's never more true than now. Okay, so apart from employment numbers, it's always curious for me to see where are the money drivers in the area. You could have a ton of retail workers, but they might not be making big economic waves because they might not have a lot of money. So looking away from just employment numbers and looking at wages paid over the last year, this stops halfway through 2022, but it's 4 quarters from mid-2021 to 2022. And you can see that where the money in Northern Utah is coming. And by Northern Utah, I mean Davis, Weber, Box, Cash, Morgan, and Ridge. It's $3.7 billion is coming from manufacturing. Then public administration, we're at $2.1 billion. Public administration covers essentially any government employment. So it covers our states and local government, but in our area, it also covers a lot of Air Force Base. And it also covers the IRS and our higher institution or educations or state schools, count into that. So for us, that's actually a great source of money. We would call these in economic terms basic industries, meaning they're industries that bring money into our area and make everybody do better. It's the idea that if I'm manufacturing something here, I'm producing it in Utah, but I'm selling it all across the United States, which is bringing money into my local economy. Versus if I'm a barber, for example, I'm really only taking money from people in the area, I'm spending it in the area, and it just kind of circles that cash in the fishbowl, right? But public administration and manufacturing, being the backbone up north, has done us a lot of favors. We were really strong through COVID. Things didn't really slow down. Government doesn't slow down, and manufacturing isn't one that was high risk, and it's when you have to show up to work to have work get done. So both of those really avoided a lot of the worst of the pandemic, which is great. Kept our area of north really strong. Utah actually altogether, this is the same growth period, February 2020, so right before the pandemic to the end of December this last year. And it shows growth rates by state. So you kind of look for a minute. I want you to keep in mind the top states, Idaho, Utah, Texas, Florida, and North Carolina, because we're going to come back to those in just a minute. But Utah obviously has done really well. 6.5% growth is fantastic because that doesn't just mean we're recovering from that pandemic and trying to make up lost jobs. This is 6.5% above where we were before the pandemic hit in the first place. So this is above and beyond the damage that we took from the pandemic. Oh, I just realized I was supposed to put this on at the very beginning. Sorry for the recording. Okay, so Utah's been doing really well, and we'll get back to why Utah's been doing that well and how we've sustained such a growth rate. Now, something to keep in mind is over that time period, this is a history of unemployment rates, right? So the big gray bar on the left is our 2008-2009 recession, right? We had unemployment rise throughout that time period, and then it fell through our prosperity in 2010s. That dotted line there in the middle is 4.5%. And for people unfamiliar with that magic number, it's considered full employment by most economists, or has been for the last couple decades. And it's the idea that you can't ever have 0% unemployment. It takes some time for people to find a new job. It takes time for companies to hire a new person to replace somebody they let go. And that frictional unemployment, that static unemployment, is usually thought to be around 4.5%. And when you go below that, when you get a rate that's below 4.5%, what you end up with is people competing for workers. There's not enough people on the sidelines to fill your workforce. You're trying to steal workers that are already employed, right? Which tends to lead to wage gains. Yeah, 4.5%. So I said, keep in mind the top growing states. We had Utah, Idaho, North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. These are, for the last census, growth rates from 2010 to 2020 by state. The top growing states are all states that have 10% or above in growth rates in population. And this is a key thing. For me as a labor economist, super exciting, but it also is just reinforcing the point here that population is a big driver of growth. Having people come in is a big driver of growth, because on the front end, it's bodies to fill the jobs that you want. But in the long term, you really need people to grow your economy in general, right? Like there's this idea that in the future, we're gonna have higher productivity using technology, so per person will be able to produce more. At the end of the day, robots don't buy things, people do. People buy houses, people buy goods. And so the population growth in general really is key to have a long-term growth in GDP, and Utah has been doing that really well. If you notice, we are the #1 growing state in the United States right now, which is key. We're growing really quickly. Where are we seeing this though? How are people coming in, and how are we maintaining that growth rate? And it's actually a lot of people moving into the state. Tons of people are moving in right now because of our great job economy. Downside is you've seen housing prices, which are just starting to lower, but this is the last few years, since 2015 and 16. This is a breakdown of population coming in. We're gonna go through a couple of the counties. This is Weber. Blue is our natural increase, people having kids. Green is international migration. And then red is domestic migration. It's people moving in from other places in the US to our local area. And you can see we actually picked up in 2015 and 16. But then as we get near 2020 drops, not a lot of people are moving. And then 2021, we have a bit more growth than we had before. A lot of people moving in. Now the whole time we've got natural increase decreasing, keep that in mind. But we've got a lot of people moving in 2021. And it's even more apparent in some of the other counties around here. Like you look at Cache County, or excuse me, Box Elder, the same kind of thing. Growth starts in 2016. We've got a lot of jobs here, strong economic growth, people are moving in. But then 2021 comes, and that huge influx is what's fueling our growth up here. It's people moving into our area. That's those kind of immigration numbers we've never seen in the county. Continuing on, Davis, you'll notice a change here as we get into the areas that are kind of bottlenecked by geography. This is where you see some of the differences in COVID. When you're looking at Cache and Box, they're not stuck between the Great Salt Lake and a mountain, and there's more room up there. People are able to move. The ease of telecommuting made rural areas more desirable, but in places like Box and Cache, you're not really that rural. You're not too far removed from everything. So it became really desirable to live up there. People have been moving, but not as much in these areas that are restricted, right? Because housing prices are moving up faster in these landlocked areas. Salt Lake, actually, I wanted to point out, is losing people. Metros are not as inviting as they were in the past, right? Like think of downtown traffic in Salt Lake. It's not particularly high right now. COVID hit that area really hard. We see an influx, an outflux out of cities kind of as decades go anyway. As crime was high in the 80s, people kind of moved out of cities. And then as gentrification happened in the 90s and 2000s, people moved back into cities. So there's kind of an influx and outflux anyway, but COVID really exacerbated that push of people are kind of moving out of city centers at this point. And where are they coming from? There's other states, but this is a high population state. And you can see a lot of people are moving from California, for example, into our area. which is great. It provides economic growth. But in our area up north, one thing to keep in mind is as we have growth in Box Elder and Cache and things like that, if it's people telecommuting to work and making a decent amount of money, you end up pricing out some people locally away from housing. If I'm working as manufacturing, it's not as easy for me to show up to work. I have to physically be there, right? So I don't want to live more than 30, 40 minutes away from work. But if I'm telecommuting to a place in California, maybe I don't want to live in California and I can telecommute just as easily from Box Elder if I wake up an hour earlier, you know? So there's that idea of how is this going to impact housing as we go forward. The other state I want to point out, Idaho, our neighbor, is the only one that we're competing with for growth. And they've just seen a ton of people moving in. This is the only way that they've been able to keep up with us in growth rates, is just they've had a ton of people moving in. So the summary of this is a graph from the Ken C. Gardner Institute. The black line at the top is our population gain per year. The red line is our natural increase, which is the net of births minus deaths. And then the gray at the bottom is our net migration. And so I want to point out here that really we've had a lot of net migration to take up as we dip, 2008, you kind of see this dip down of natural increase, right? And we'll get into this. I think people have heard this before, probably. It's the whole baby boomer thing, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but we have a large chunk of our population that's getting older and not as many people are having kids. So the natural increase is decreasing. And what's made up that difference largely is this in-migration to our state. All right, so all this, there's a lot of pressure going on. We haven't even touched on some of the stuff like inflation, which obviously makes a difference, wage gains and competition. So we're gonna get into that, some of the pressures in the labor force right now. So this competition for workers with us below the unemployment rate of 4.5% leads to wage gains, right? Like I said, there's not enough people to go around. If there's 20 seats for engineers and only 15 engineers, generally the 15 best paid seats are the seats they're gonna care to sit at, and 5 are gonna go left unfilled. And to fill one of those seats, you have to make them one of the best 15 seats to sit in, so you need to pay more. And we've seen that over the last year, that competition for workers has led to wage gains. Wage gains aren't spread evenly. What industry and occupation they're in does matter. And it does a couple interesting things. It decreases the value of seniority. For example, if I'm hiring people and I have to be competitive about it, I'll hire them starting at like $50,000 a year. Well, my buddy George has been working for me for 10 years and he only makes 52, or worse yet, he only makes 48. And that kind of stuff makes him think, well, why am I here? Because if you're paying that much for a new person, think about how much another company would pay, right? And that's on top of, if I want you to have the same quality of life that you had last year, I need to pay you more just from inflation, right? About 2% every year anyway, and worse over the last year. So it makes it really difficult to hold on to employees during the time period because it decreases the value of seniority. Where we've seen this is kind of, we have this gut feeling that started in 2020 of service occupations becoming less desirable to work at, harder to work at, and thus better paid. And that has really held true. So this is 4.25% change divided up into 5 different occupation groups. That top one, service occupations, is by far and away the one that's gained the most, up to 8.5%. Now keep in mind the background of this is inflation that we've done over the last year. So unless you're getting up to 8% raises in wages, you're not making more money than you were last year, right? And that's an issue for these other people who are only getting raises of 4.5%, right? So we're going to talk about inflation. Important to keep in mind the definition of inflation, which is more money chasing fewer goods, right? So it can happen on either side of that equation. It can happen on the supply side or on the demand side. And there's been several things on both of those sides of the equation that have made inflation really bad over the last year. So federal aid from the pandemic, we've got a lot of new money circulating. That's more money, right? High demand for goods. If you look at demand graphs after 2020, there's this linear relationship of demand. Pandemic brings it down a little bit. And then after the pandemic, it skyrockets. It doesn't go back to what it was. It's way higher than it was beforehand. And so we've got high demand for goods, supply chain disruptions. So we've mentioned the Ukraine war, but it's also things like the Suez Canal, the boat getting stuck in there, things like that, or our eggs, where we've got issues getting those. And labor shortages is another one that to get your company moving forward, to hire people, to get a company or to get a project off the ground, you need people, and people are kind of in light supply right now. So to try and curb inflation, we've got the Federal Reserve trying to raise rates, bring things down. They just met a week ago and raised rates by 0.25. And you can see kind of where that's taken a dip, right? Where inflation peaks halfway through the year and then starts to come down. This is historical. I just want to point out for the Fed, what they're supposed to do is keep inflation stable at 2%. 2% is objective or subjective. They've decided that that's what they want. But the biggest thing is that it's relatively low and it's supposed to be predictable. So seeing a little bit further back, we can see from like the 2010s all the way through 2020. That red line of the CPI is below that 2% target that they have for the majority of the time, right? And then past 2020, it was down for a little bit and then just skyrockets as it goes up. Now, keep in mind, the reason the average hourly earnings go up so much when the pandemic hit is actually a flux in the data, because who had to go home? Service workers who don't make a lot of money, who kept working, people who could telecommute and had to go to work, like manufacturers who made more money. So average hourly income for that little bit of time actually went up a ton, because people who didn't make very much money weren't working at all. But then it returns back to normal. A year later, we've got the dip just because it's compared against the year before. But the key here is you see as inflation starts to skyrocket, similarly right after and kind of concurrently, you've got wages increasing too, right? But then at the same time as inflation starts to come down, wages stop that increasing rise, right? They kind of plateau there. And you can see that too, actually, if we go back here, you see private is that red line. Private maxed out halfway through the year and it started to come back down. So why is that? Federal funds rate, right? They raise the rate. It makes the cost of doing business more expensive, makes everything slow down, but was, as far as we can tell, and hopefully going into the future, there's a lot of uncertainty, it has started inflation slowing down. So as we look at inflation over the last couple of years, this is 2019 on the left all the way through to 2023, as much data as we have, breaking down the CPI into core services, core goods, food, and energy. And you can see basically where they started taking action, right? And raising rates pretty aggressively in 2022 to try and bring things down. It had, energy has started coming down. Food is still pretty high. We all know the story about the eggs right now, right? But it's stuff like that. But it also has bled pretty, core services don't look like they're headed down. So a lot of this is here to stay. People ask me sometimes, is inflation going to come down? It would be a huge surprise, right? And we'll see that going into the future, as we get a year out from some of these wage gains, we'll see inflation come down like percentage-wise in growth, but you won't necessarily see a lot of prices come down to the prices they were beforehand. You will see individual goods come down, but inflation itself and the value of the dollar probably will not change. Going into the future, one thing that we can point out here is you can also see if they annualize these rates, what is it going to look like going forward? The worst inflation after February 2020, right? We see really bad inflation on the top there. They start to respond shortly afterwards. And then the last few months of 2022, if you annualize those rates out, they're less than the 2% target, which is the goal, right? We're trying to hit 2%, not necessarily less than 2%, but like 2% right on, as close as we can get. And the rates that they've been able to achieve for the last few months, if we just expand those months out, do achieve an annual rate of about 2%. So going forward, what do these predictions kind of lead us to? This is from the Conference Board, which is an economic body that does a lot of different, they're nationally based in Washington, D.C., and they do a lot of different projections, and they're worth listening to. So I've been watching their projections for the next little bit. Now keep in mind, it's difficult to come up with good projections. I stole this from them before they had Q4 of 2022. So if you look in the top left there, that's GDP growth, and Q4 of 2022 was not 0.7%, it was higher than that. So it's really hard sometimes to come up with completely accurate guesses for this. Keep that in mind. Economists are terrible weathermen. We can tell you that a storm is coming, but I can't tell you if it's today or next week. So, but what we're guessing is if things stay the way that they are. The box right there is 2023 and end of 2022. The forecast is that we should have a couple months of declining GDP before we go back into growth again. Unemployment across the nation should only reach about 4.5%, which, as we've talked about, is not actually that bad. Our total non-farm unemployment should drop a bit. In Utah, I don't think we'll see a lot of job loss. And then our labor force participation rate will continue to decline. That's an interesting one too. So looking at it, we've got another one, the Kiplinger letter. I'm just pointing out here that two major economic bodies in the US, the Kiplinger letter is another, it's 100 years old. It's done a ton of announcements over, and it's fairly accurate. They point out two here at the bottom. Unemployment will increase moderately, expect the jobless rate to hit almost 5% by year end. Now, one thing that the economists kind of debate is some people like to use the unemployment rate as an idea of how hot the economy is, right? And there you'll sometimes read, economists want to see X% of unemployment rate before they feel like before inflation is going to come down. And it's related back to the idea that wage competition is going to lead to inflation. But what I want to argue is that 4.5% unemployment rate that we've looked at historically is getting a little lower than it was. Realistically, the idea there with frictional employment is that there's automatically a little bit of buffer in time between somebody gets hired at a new job, right? But that time, I would argue, is decreasing with technology, that the ease of The ease of passing information from employer to employee and backwards is getting easier and easier. If you want a job and you just want to be employed, it's not hard to just go drive for Uber. No, it's probably not the job you want, and it's probably not the most money you can make, but you're employed and you have a job. And all this comes together to say that, you know, a lot of the pain in recessions, a lot of the worry in recessions is, am I going to lose my job, right? Because on the aggregate, if the US isn't like totally going downhill, but I'm okay and my family's okay, I'm not as stressed about it. But as soon as I lose my job, or I'm worried that I'm going to lose my job in the next 3 months, or my company announces layoffs, then it introduces a lot of changes in my behavior. I'm not going to spend money. I'm not going to behave the same way, right? A lot of the pain comes with the unemployment. And in Utah in particular, we're really not going to see a lot of bad labor market here, right? Because labor is already so tight, and there's so much competition for it that as people get laid off, like you're hearing about layoffs in tech, for example, they're going to get soaked up by other industries that are desperate for labor, right? Okay, so am I doing okay on time? Okay, 6 minutes. We'll try and blaze through this. So I've talked before, and I'm sure people here are kind of familiar with this idea that baby boomers are a huge percentage of our population, and they're getting older, right? So the idea here is that things are kind of shifting and baby boomers are exiting the labor force. We anticipated that already, but as many recessions do, COVID exacerbated a lot of the things that were underlying in the economy already. Baby boomers became the largest section of the labor force in 2016, but in Utah, we actually got that about 8 or 10 years earlier, because there was a whole new generation in Utah of young people in the 1980s that the US didn't get, which is part of why we've had really good growth rates here. But baby boomers retiring leads into a couple things we've talked about. It leads to higher inflation, because like we talked about, it's more money chasing fewer goods. These are people who have money who are buying goods, and as they retire, they're no longer producing goods, right? So you have more money chasing fewer goods. Hard to buy houses in certain places in Utah and in the US. Hard to replace workers and managers, right? Managers are leaving without people behind them to replace them. Baby boomers are overrepresented in blue collar work like manufacturing. They make up a larger percentage of that labor force than, for example, IT or retail trade. So to see baby boomers is leaving is kind of worrying for us, because we want to make sure that we keep our institutional knowledge up. It also leads to things like larger government spending. Social Security had its largest cost of living adjustment since 1981, right? Because it's pegged to the CPI. So government spending increases too. Going on, this whole thing actually kind of ties into, it's not just that a big portion of our population is getting older and passing away, it's also that we're not having as many kids as we used to. And this is a big key where I tied back that strong growth rates in GDP, strong growth rates in jobs, tie with strong population gains. That's going to be a struggle, is our population gains. So here we've got a list of US population growth for 1790 all the way through. The only other time that we've had rates as low as this is 1930 to 1940. Anyone want to guess why that is? What was happening during that time period? Great Recession. I've seen a lot of people mouth it. Yeah, a Great Depression, not recession. So we had the Great Depression during that time period, and people didn't have kids. But outside of that, we haven't had rates this low ever in US history. We're not alone in this. Most first world countries end up hitting this. As your quality of life goes up, as your GDP goes up, birth rates tend to come down. You can see the last 3 censuses, 1990 to 2000, 2000 to 2010, and 2010 to 2020, the top 8 growing states and their percentages. And if you look, I mean, first on the bottom, in 1990 to 2000, no states were losing population. And now we're getting there, where we're starting to see some states lose population over the last census, which is a big deal. Like, for example, California lost for the first time in history, lost a House representative, because their population loss was, other states were gaining population at the same time, so they got a representative taken away. But you can see here, it's kind of interesting. Like in 1990 to 2010, Nevada obviously had tons of people moving in, 66% growth rate. But Utah's up there at 30%. That's not nothing, right? 10 years go by and we move from the 4th fastest growing state to the 3rd fastest growing state, but we went from 30% growth down to 24%. 10 years go by. Utah, now number 1 growing state, like I pointed out, we're the fastest growing state in the nation, 18.4%. Which is lower and would have put us at 7th place a decade before, right? So there's this idea that birth rates in general across the US are slowing down, and Utah didn't slow down at the same time, but we are slowing down too. Now you can see, this is from the Kempsey Gardner Institute too. Replacement rates are 2.1 kids per married couple. And United States fell below that in 1970, about 10 years after birth control came out, and Utah held on for a long, long time. But just barely we caught up, and now we're not having as many kids, right? which is a potential problem. You can actually see this. This is per annual percentage change in US population from 1900 to 2021. So as long as we're above that line at the bottom, we're growing. And first thing is we're very close to that line on the bottom on the far right, where we are right now. So if you look historically, we've got World War I, that huge dip here in the left, right? Great Depression, World War II, that huge dip between 1930s and 1940s. You go to 50, and then interestingly at 1960, it seems that that high rate we had outside of wars changes really fundamentally to a much slower rate. What got approved in 1960 by the FDA? Oral contraceptives for birth control. So we have a lower rate all the way through the 70s and 80s. 80s was a really big deal for United States versus Utah. Utah had another generation of kids from the baby boomers, and the US did not. It's going to be a problem for us going forward because they're going to want to take laborers from us, which could be a problem. So we're dipping down here to almost losing population by the time we get to 2021, right? Another big dip when we hit the pandemic, but you can see this rate kind of drops just from 2000 on. This is not just a pandemic issue, right? This is a long-term issue that we've had coming for a while. And we're not alone in this. So we've had immigration in Utah to keep that growth up, but nationally to keep our GDP growing, you really do want growth rates. I have only a couple minutes left, so we're going to try and speed through the last bit here. This is that idea too, that why is our population dipping so much? Well, it's two things. You see, from 2010 right here, you see our births kind of tick up, right? We've got aging population, our birth rate, or excuse me, our death rate is ticking up, that red. The blue on the top starting to come down, as we've seen in the one before. This is only the last few years. It looks like it's moving down slowly, but you've seen in the past where it was way higher than this. And then that bottom line, the gray dotted one, is immigration from outside of the United States. And in 2016, policies changed and immigration dropped. And in 2020 and 2021, we had the lowest immigration to the United States that we've had in US history. So that's another potential problem with not having enough labor coming into the United States. Second thing, retirees, people have decided not to come back from COVID. That's a big one. People over 55 had really started leaving. So you can look at this historical rate of retirements that kind of ticked up in 2010, right, as baby boomers are starting to age out. But then as we hit 2020, you can see that jump when the pandemic happens as people retire, and they just don't come back. They stay retired, right? So that's the idea here. Why did people leave? Why are people still out of the labor market? And the top reason is retired. 4 million people retired. I don't want to come back. So where we see that is, actually, I'm just going to skip that because we've got limited time. So we do see that in labor force participation rates. We have people potentially not coming in still, right? Younger people aren't participating in the labor market as much as they used to in the past. But we've still got that depression from COVID in general, keeping people out. It's about 15,000 people. We don't know exactly in Utah how many people of those are retired versus people just not coming back, for example, for healthcare or childcare, or they decided to go back to school. Something's going to take them a little bit of time to finish, or a situation they've got to get out of. But we've got about 15,000 people in Utah that if we had the same labor force participation rate pre-pandemic, now we'd have that many more. All right, so what are 6 plausible or combined macro solutions for this kind of stuff? Keep in mind, these are all economic solutions, and economic solutions can be a little morally gray. So morally gray means like if I want to raise the per capita income of an area, we could come in and just forcefully remove everybody who made less than an amount of money or didn't make any money at all. And then the per capita income would go up a lot, like we saw during COVID when low income earners couldn't work, the hourly average income raised a lot. So these are morally ambiguous, but we could incentivize or pressure baby boomers to remain in the labor force, change laws, for example, on what age you're allowed to get Social Security. We could import products and meet demand, try and come up with better trade agreements. Tricky time right now with how much international confusion there is going on, and that we've seen a lot of evidence that nationalizing some industries are worthwhile. We could import labor from other countries, make it easier to move into the state. We could offset departing labor with automation and artificial intelligence, which in short doesn't actually decrease jobs or doesn't increase jobs. We can incentivize births, or we can let the economy naturally shrink. I am out of time, so I will move on to questions. But I want to point out that really quick, I'll end here. Just last week, Kempsey Gardner Institute gave a report to the governor. They do this every year. It's the economic review for forecast and review. And they surveyed a bunch of people, and these are a lot, colleges, DWS, different economic institutions, on what they expect for the next year to be in 2023 and 2024. And what I want to point out for Utah, our unemployment rate, they never expected to go above 3%. So as far as pain to the individual person, we're still dealing with inflation, and that's a hard unknown because there's not a lot of control we have over that on the state side. But stateside, as far as unemployment and how painful any potential economic downturn would be, is really minimal right now because it shouldn't hurt individual people. We shouldn't have people losing jobs, and people who lose jobs should be able to find something relatively quickly. So any questions in the couple of minutes I have? It's a lot of data really quickly. Sometimes you got to sit and digest for a minute. Perfect. Well, that makes up for the time I spent that I wasn't supposed to. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. No.
Thanks, Michael. That was a fantastic presentation. Appreciate that. Well, my next speaker, reading his bio, I expected him to be a lot older than what he was when I met him. So very impressive achievements. Miles Hansen is president and CEO of World Trade Center, Utah. Hansen was most recently the director of Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council in the White House. Prior to that, he served as a staff aide to the State Department's Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. He served as a diplomatic liaison with Saudi Aramco and advised U.S. government and private sector leaders on the Saudi energy industry. He served tours focused on Iran at the U.S. Embassy in Armenia. Hansen is a graduate of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and from Brigham Young University. He's a speaker of Russian, Farsi, and Arabic, and has firsthand experience in more than 70 countries, and is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Miles Hansen.
It is so good to be with everybody today. Brandon, thank you very much for that introduction. And Chuck, well done. This is absolutely fantastic. Congratulations to the Ogden Weber Chamber, to the Bank of Utah, Weber State. It is fantastic to see so many people here and knowing that right here where we are is the engine of economic prosperity and growth of the state of Utah, the most consistent engine. You think about Silicon Slopes, and I don't want to throw any shade on our friends down south, but things go up and things go down in the tech industry. And right now we've seen over and over a lot of challenges down in Silicon Slopes with the tech industry. And yet, as Michael just presented to us, here in the Weber Ogden area, the engine of economic prosperity is very, very strong. You're resilient, you're moving forward, and that creates so much stability for our economy and for our state as we go out there to compete and win around the world. Brandon, thank you so much for that introduction. We've learned that we share the same last name. We're both Hansens. We'll have to figure out and compare notes on the family tree before too long. But one thing I do know is Brandon's from the branch of the family that has more hair than my side. So I may be a little bit younger, but I'm struggling a lot more than you are up here. And I guess I don't shave as much as I should just to try to compensate a little bit. But it's so great, Brandon, the chance to meet. And Michael, well done. That was absolutely fascinating. I love economics. President Mortensen, I think, is here. What a great product of Weber State to help keep all of us informed. And that data is fascinating. One key takeaway for me is population growth. This is important. I've got 5 kids, and so I guess I'm doing my part on that front. We spent some time in California. My wife's from California. We were in a store one time, and somebody saw all the kids. And the person there at the store criticized my wife and said, don't you know you're going to overpopulate the world? It's such a problem, and kind of went on. And my wife said, listen, lady, my kids are going to be paying your Social Security someday. So you may as well thank us for what we're doing to keep Social Security strong. So really quickly, as I jump in and share a few thoughts that have been on my mind as of late, just for anybody who may not be aware, World Trade Center Utah is an organization here in the state that exists to accelerate global growth for Utah companies. We help companies identify export markets. We help companies raise capital. Over the past 18 months, the supply chains have been so challenging. We help companies optimize their supply chains on stick problems, whether it's with tariffs or sourcing. And so please, anytime, any way that we can assist, don't hesitate, reach out. I'll be here. Michelle Connolly is here from the World Trade Center Utah team. She leads all of our partner engagement. So please come in and talk to us. We've worked with great companies like Boresight, WT Dynamics, Blue Sky Energy, JBT Aerotech, and we've taken these companies and helped them get connected with global partners around the world. And so we can help globalize our economy. And we do this to help companies grow, but our vision as an organization is to make Utah not just the crossroads of the West, but the crossroads of the world. And I'll talk here in a little bit about more what I mean by that. But before I jump in, I just wanted to ask, we're up here, we're close to the Air Force Base. Who here in the room has served in the military? Go ahead and just raise your hand. We have a few people here. Let's go ahead and give them a round of applause. The military is such an important component of our national security, of our economy, of our way of life. It also is an incredible source of acronyms. And so the acronym I want to share with you is BLUF. Anybody in the military knows what BLUF stands for. Many of you do. Bottom line up front. A BLUF in the military is designed to force clarity in communication and decision making. And so my BLUF today, my bottom line up front, is that in a darkening world with growing challenges, more conflict, and yet less cooperation, the Utah way of building, innovating, and collaborating together is having a leavening effect, not only on our state, and we see that in Michael's report on the economy, but also across the country and through our global engagement that we're so committed to at World Trade Center Utah, we're having a leavening effect on the rest of the world. And so despite all the challenges we see in the headlines, the future is bright. The future bright is right here for everybody in this room. The future is bright for Northern Utah and for our state. And we see a significant opportunity for Utah to play a larger role nationally and globally. So I want to talk a little bit more about these global dynamics. I want to talk about a very critical issue that's facing everybody in the room, I'm confident, which is China. But before I do that, I first, I thought I'd tell a quick story of an experience that I had that really helped have a profound impact on me on how I view everything that's happening around the world. And so when we see things in headlines, we talk about global trends, we have a little bit of a frame to say, okay, what is happening and how can we think about that? The story starts in April of 2018. I was working at the time at the White House and the National Security Council. And if you may remember, at that point, the Syrian war was raging. In April 2018, Bashar al-Assad regime, with Russian support, conducted a horrific chemical weapons attack, killed hundreds of men, women, and children in the most horrific manner you could possibly imagine. The pictures were absolutely devastating, and it was a terrible thing. And so, as a White House team focusing on Middle East issues, we had to ask ourselves, okay, what do we do? What do we do about this? A red line had been crossed, and how do we respond? There was no question there was going to be a response, but how significant? How many people are going to die? Do we do it during the nighttime when you degrade capabilities, or do you do it during the daytime and you take personnel off of the battlefield? And so that attack kicked into a very, very intense week. And so we were all working overtime as we work with our partners, we assess with the military, with intelligence and everything else to try to come up with an appropriate response to this chemical weapon attack. Days go by and pretty soon it's been 5 or 6 days and we're getting ready to go. It happened to be a Friday, was the day that we knew what the plan was and we were going to execute that plan. And my day started at about 6 in the morning. I was in the office. John Bolton was National Security Advisor at the time. And we started off the day by making a series of phone calls to our partners to communicate exactly what our response was going to be. We did that through the day and prepared things. Syria is about a 7-hour time difference between Syria and Washington, D.C. And so it was early evening time at the White House when it was early morning time in Syria. And so we decided that we were going to degrade Syrian capabilities, but we were going to do it at night. And so we could be more intense with the bombardment that we provided, that we attacked Syria with, but also trying to minimize collateral damage and casualties. And so we all gathered in the White House Situation Room, and it's not as cool as what it is in the movies. It's kind of a boring conference room with a couple TV screens up on the wall. We gathered there, but in this case, there's a big map of Syria in the region. We are doing it in partnership with our British and French colleagues and partners who had warships in the Mediterranean Sea that were going to fire missiles. We are going to have a lot of airplanes in the air taking off from Doha, Qatar, Al-Udeid Air Base, one of the largest air bases in the world, and they're going to fly west into Syria. And so we all sat down. The military chatter and communication was on the audio, and it was super tense. Everybody was there, worked our guts out all week long, and you're watching this thing play out. And you see U.S. planes leaving and kind of little dots on the radar on the screen, getting closer to Syria. As they enter Syrian airspace, you see missiles leaving the warships in the Mediterranean Sea. You see our airplanes going to get closer to target. You see Syrian missile defense starting to attack, and you see the missiles going off. One of them went off to the north towards like Armenia. And at first we're like, wait, what's going on? And then we realized it was just an errant missile. They weren't trying to attack Armenia. But you go in the situation, you see the missiles hit target, you hear the military communication, you see our planes leaving Syrian airspace, and then we get out of Syrian airspace. And right then, there's just a huge sense of relief, knowing that the women and men that were flying those jets were out of Syrian airspace, they were out of danger. And all of a sudden, the mood changed. And everybody was laughing and joking and celebratory. It happened to be Friday night. People had some food and drinks in the corner. And so we were out there just kind of celebrating that this thing just happened and that everybody was safe. And then out of nowhere, there was a phenomenal crash on the big table. Well, we're gonna go silent. We look over, and John Kelly, who at the time was the White House Chief of Staff, former military general, he is 6'3" and as imposing as you'd imagine a general to be, stood there and he pounded his fist on the table again. And he said something I never forget. He said, "There is no joy in this." He said, "There are people dying right now out there. It doesn't matter if they're good guys or bad guys, there is no joy in this." And he put his hand on the table again and he walked out the door. Now, I'll never forget that experience because I realized that he was exactly right. As we look at what's happening in the world, and I talked about a few of the issues here in a quick overview in a few minutes, so easy to think of the world as a game of risk. So easy to look at the map and think of Russia and China and Ukraine and France and Germany and Japan with the United States, whatever it may be. And we lose sight of the fact that there are real people out there. And from my experience, the vast majority of people, I've spent time in Iran and Afghanistan and Russia and China, a lot of other countries, the vast majority of people everywhere are good. And the third key lesson for me was that nothing is inevitable. We talk about global trends, but global trends are really just the cumulative effect of billions of individual choices that people make each and every day. In this case, it was Bashar al-Assad ultimately decided to use Syrian chemical weapons against his own people. Vladimir Putin decided that his military was going to support and aid and abet and support and enable that action. And the president decided that we were going to retaliate in the manner that we did. But ultimately, those were decisions that people made. And as I think about that, it helps me realize that we all have a role to play. As we think about the challenges that exist, each and every one of us on a daily basis with our own sphere of influence have the ability to choose to go out there and again, to try to have a leavening effect. Governor Cox talks about being builders and not destroyers. And why I'm so bullish about here in Utah and the strength that we have and that strength growing over time is because we're a community of builders. And we see it right here in this room with all the great companies. You're going out there, you're innovating, you're competing with great determination, you're building. And that creates great strength for us. And I believe with that strength comes accountability and a responsibility for each of us to decide that we're to go out there and be builders in the world. So with that framing, and I hope that helps explain a little bit of how I perceive the different challenges and risks and opportunities and conflicts that we see out in the world. I'd like to talk a little bit about China. It's the issue that we deal with more than anything else at World Trade Center, Utah. And just curious, who here does business in China? Raise your hand. Okay, we got a few hands. Who here has clients, members, university students, or otherwise from China or doing business in China? Okay, we get a few more hands. Who here is buy stuff from China? There we go. Now all the hands come up, right? This is something that affects each and every one of us. And so this is something that we all have to understand and think through as we see this relationship growing more tense and more challenges despite the economic realities that exist. I think it's important to note that despite all the rhetoric and all the challenges, last year, US-China bilateral trade reached an all-time high, which shows the interdependence, which shows the reality of these trade relationships, even as we've all seen in the news, most recently, we see white-hot rhetoric and great white balloons that are dominating the headlines and are a reason for a lot of concern. And so as we work with companies, one thing that we help them understand is first and foremost, what we've seen the past few years are tectonic shifts in the way that the United States and our partners around the world are viewing China. Quick history lesson: for 40 years, on a bipartisan basis, Democrats and Republicans believed that as we empowered China economically, as China developed economically, that would lead to more empowered citizens, which in turn would lead to liberalizing politically, greater respect for human rights, and less assertive foreign policy. Beginning in 2014, 2015, and 2016, there slowly became a realization among policymakers, again, Republicans and Democrats, it's a nonpartisan issue, but a realization that unfortunately didn't play out the way that we thought. And instead of economic development leading to modernization, what we were seeing is that greater economic might led to more political oppression at home, less respect for human rights, and more assertive foreign policy. There's a great article, but it was in the Atlantic in December of 2016 that lays out the shift in this thinking. You can tell that the author, when they wrote it, that they assumed that Hillary Clinton would be the president instead it was Donald Trump, but the principles were the same. And I always refer people to that to demonstrate that there was kind of a common understanding at that time that we had to figure out how to break the inertia, the policy inertia that existed for 40 years and recalibrate and figure out what to do. And it's been painful over the past few years. For any of you businesses that source in China or sell into China, or some Utah companies will bring product in from China, add value here and re-export it. One company goes back and forth between the United States and China, but they have very complex equipment and machinery several times. And so all the trade wars, all the tariffs, more investment screening, more export controls, all of these things have created a lot of challenges. And then that's all against the backdrop of these rising geopolitical tensions between the two countries. And so as we work with companies, the number one piece of advice that we give them is there is no going back to the way it used to be. Some people would think, okay, once the trade war is done, we can just go back to the way it was. There is no going back. The world is fundamentally different, which means as companies, we have to think fresh. We have to think anew about what our China engagement looks like. And the second key takeaway is that there's no one size fits all approach. Some people talk about decoupling the economies, 100% breaking all trade between the two countries. And like I just pointed out, despite a lot of policy levers to try to reduce the economic leverage that China has over the United States and over US companies, in 2022, we saw all-time highs in terms of volume of trade. And so it's decoupling 100% doesn't make sense to me. Trying to tell all companies in every industry that the same approach is necessary doesn't make sense to me. Each company has to think through a framework that makes sense for their industry. And so what we do at World Trade Center Utah is we help companies think through kind of three different questions. The first one is, what's your risk profile? Okay, if you are a company that is developing software that runs semiconductor fabs or manufacturing centers, your risk profile of selling into China is pretty darn high, right? You think about intellectual property, think about semiconductors, think about all those things. That is very, very high risk profile. A company needs to assess that and understand that. If you are another Utah company that is selling protein, so pork, beef, chicken, pig feet, those types of things into China, your risk profile is probably pretty low, right? And so depending, and then there's a range in between those 2 points. So depending on your business or the business of your clients or whoever it is that you're interfacing with, what's that risk profile? And really think deeply about what that is. With that understanding, then you can ask yourself, what's the risk premium that is baked into our business as a result of our risk profile? And that's when you're making business decisions about where do you sell, where do you invest, where do you open a new office, where do you source from? That risk premium has to be accounted for. And so if you're a company that's 95%, if you're a manufacturer here in the state that's 95% dependent on your sourcing from China, I'd say that's a pretty high risk profile, because due to no fault of your own, you may wake up one day and find out that you've been cut out of that market. If you're 95% dependent, that's going to be decimating for your business. So if that's your business, that's a high risk profile. So then when you think about, okay, we have to expand our sourcing or source of a production, if you just look at the bottom line based on what you're doing, it may make economic sense to put that additional expansion in China. But if you think about the risk premium that exists as a result of your risk profile, now all of a sudden you factor in that cost and alternatives may make a lot of sense. It's just like if we think about our household income, right? If I'm just maximizing my take-home pay, then I wouldn't pay for flood insurance or fire insurance or home insurance, right? But we pay those things to mitigate risk. And there's a premium there that depends on where we live and the size of the house and everything else based on the risk profile as the insurance companies view that. And so we challenge companies to go through this process and figure out what that risk premium is. Based off of that, then that allows you to do the third thing, which is to develop a risk mitigation plan. Given the risk premium and your risk profile, what does that mean for your business? And how do you make sure that you have a plan prepared so that you can go and execute that if the things that you're at risk to actually occur? I've got home insurance, I pay that bill every month, and if if the fire burns down my house, my plan is I call the insurance company and say, hey, boy, am I glad I've been paying that premium, come and help pay for my new house. But if you're a business, and say you're like Australian wine producers, who China is the #1 market for exporters of wine from Australia, a huge market, it's the driver of the industry. And then one day the Australian government decides to question China's early response to COVID, the pandemic. And in retaliation, the Chinese government cuts off Australian wine producers from being able to export into China. Or Norwegian salmon producers, who several years ago, again, for Norwegian salmon selling into China is a major market. It's very, very important. The Norwegian government criticized China for human rights. And then one day, those Norwegian salmon producers found themselves by and large cut out of the Chinese market. So the challenge for Utah companies, even if you have a low risk profile, there is a risk premium. What do those Australian wine producers or the Norwegian salmon producers wish they would have done 5 or 6 years ago to prepare for a day where they're cut out of that market? Or maybe there's 100 other challenges that could occur. And so as long as you are thinking ahead of what your mitigation plan is, then if something goes south, you've got a plan to go and execute. If you're 95% dependent on sourcing from China and you diversify, maybe paying a little bit more, but that's for your risk premium. And so then you drop it down, so it's more like 40%, and you've got 3 other places at 20% each. If one day you wake up and you're cut out of that market, you'll then have an opportunity. It'll be tough, but it's a lot easier to go and replace 40% if you've got 20% in 3 other places than it is to go and replace 95% overnight. And it'll be a bad day, a bad week, and a bad month. You're going to be okay as a business. And so you've got to make sure you know what that plan is. And if we're strategic, we get out in front of this, then we can have great confidence here in Utah that we're going to navigate these challenges better than other countries. And it's absolutely critical that we think about this. Even when things get tough, even if, we saw this during the pandemic, overnight the economy comes to a screeching halt, or many aspects of it. There could be a across the board decrease in productivity or competitiveness or an economic slowdown. But if we are relatively stronger than everybody else, even in a situation where everybody goes down, we're relatively stronger, our competitive advantage will actually increase relative to other states, other countries, other competitors, and other industries. And so we have to remain confident, we have to remain engaged. And if we do those things, then we're gonna be just fine. And that's why we're so bullish at World Trade Center Utah about what opportunities exist for Utah companies out in the world, no matter what challenges exist, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, whether it's China, whether it's supply chain issues. The rise of industrial policy is another mega trend. We see more government intervention in the economy than we've ever seen in generations. And companies are having to deal with those challenges. We've got workforce issues and how do you attract and retain talent? And so that brings me back to where I started and back to that bluff. In a darkening world with growing challenges, more conflict, and yet less cooperation, this Utah way of building, innovating, and collaborating together really is having a leavening effect on our state, on our country, and on the rest of the world. And so despite all the challenges globally for each and every one of us, the future is bright here in the state of Utah. Let's get to it. Thank you. And I think we want to do questions, or should I hang out and do questions after? I think we've got some time for a couple questions. Okay. I think there are some roaming mics somewhere around here. Yeah, please.
My question is, what do the businessmen in China think of United States businessmen? How does that go from business to business? Is that still pretty strong?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And that gets back to the reality that the vast majority of people in every country are good. not like you and I. They're out there trying to build a business. They want to be builders in their own communities, just like we all want to be builders in our community. And so, yes, by and large, you see Chinese business owners very, very eager to maintain strong relationships with their US partners. A lot of these relationships are decades long, and it's created a lot of wealth and prosperity and created a lot of jobs in both markets. That is, in my mind, why trade is so important all the time, but maybe even especially when there is increasing tension, because it creates these relationships of trust that make it easier to find common sense solutions to the challenges that exist on a kind of a national level, but also on an individual company level. Now, having said that, what we see in China is a state-owned, state-dominated economy. And so they have the ability as a government to come in with a very, very heavy hand. And there's not the freedom or flexibility among Chinese business owners to resist that. And so that then becomes a drag and a risk to those strong relationships that may exist. Other questions? Chuck.
You see on a global basis, are any markets or areas, regions where there's greater opportunity for business growth for Utah or?
Is there opportunity for growth in the rural pockets where you see, that's opening up, or it's easier, or that's an area that businesses in Utah need to explore more and see about providing business services?
Yeah, 10,000%. There's a lot of opportunity. It's funny, we sit there, there's a big map in our office, and we will do 15 or 16 international trips this year. We're taking groups of Utah companies out into different markets, and we could easily do 24, 25. And there's just so much opportunity, but just limited bandwidth to go out there. But a couple that are not top of mind for everybody that we see a lot of opportunities. One is Southeast Asia, not just on the sourcing supply chain side, and although that's real, but you see a lot of growth in these emerging markets, large populations, developing economies as you have more and more consumers, very industrialized, and you see very large investments from governments into industrializing and building industry. And that creates a tremendous amount of opportunity for companies in the Philippines as well. The other one is the Middle East. When you think about North Africa and the Middle East region, I'm biased. I live there and I work there a lot, so I admit my bias 100%. But what we're seeing in these economies that have been dominated by oil for decades is a recognition that they have to diversify their economies, and they're doing so from a position of great strength relative to the capital that they have to do that. And so, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, we're seeing what I believe is the most rapid transformation of their economy and society of any country since probably the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. So with that disruption, with a bias towards American companies and a strong partnership there, it creates a lot of opportunity. Michelle actually 2 days ago was in Riyadh with a group of Utah companies looking at those opportunities as well. Okay, maybe time for one more question. One more question. All right, going once, going twice. Sold. Brandon, back to you.
Thanks, Miles. Awesome presentation. Thank you. And thank you for the work you're doing at World Trade Center Utah to help Utah companies. For our next presenter and final presenter, I had the opportunity yesterday evening to have dinner with him, and this individual is incredibly impressive. Brian Smedley is the chief economist and head of macroeconomic investment research at Guggenheim Investments. Prior to joining Guggenheim, Mr. Smedley was head of U.S. short rates research at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. In this role, he covered treasuries, interest rate derivatives, and money markets, as well as Federal Reserve policy. Smedley began his career at the New York Fed in the Emerging Markets and International Affairs Group, where he was the senior economist covering Latin America. Mr. Smedley earned a bachelor's degree in economics and finance from Utah State University, and he earned a master's degree in international development studies from the George Washington University. Let's welcome Brian Smedley.
Okay, I passed the mic test, so we're ready to get started. Thank you, Brandon. It's really exciting to be here. I appreciate your invitation, and thanks to the whole Bank of Utah team. Thanks to my friend Brandon, Eric DeFries for setting this up and helping facilitate. I'm grateful for the chance to come home. I've lived on the coast for 20 years now, but I grew up in Layton, Utah. As Brandon said, I went to Utah State University, was born right down the road at McCady Hospital. So it's fun to come back and see family and friends and talk a little bit about the outlook for the US economy from an investor perspective. Okay, good. So as was mentioned, I work at a firm called Guggenheim Investments. We're part of Guggenheim Partners, a holding company, and the Guggenheim Investments team manages about $300 billion in client assets. A lot of that is life insurance money. A lot of our funds are fixed income oriented. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the outlook for the macroeconomy and interest rates. And as was mentioned, that's what I've spent a lot of my time thinking about. So, you know, the title of the presentation is An Investor's Guide to the Coming Recession. So, you know, again, what we're trying to do, my team, let me, I guess, introduce a little bit about what I do. My team of economists and strategists, step one is to try to get a good sense of where we are. Step two is to try to look down the road and identify where things are heading in the future. And then step three is to work backward and identify what market opportunities and risks may exist, right? You may have a good assessment of the present situation. You may have an accurate forecast of the future, but if the market is already anticipating that and is already pricing that in, the market may end up doing the opposite of what you expect, right? When you get to that future state, and that's often the case. So it's a bit of triangulating. What I thought we could start with is take a look at the present situation, and Michael talked a little bit about this in his great presentation. But we're going to start with a view of aggregate demand, which has been running far too strong in the post-pandemic period. So as was noted, we had a significant plunge in economic activity in the span of 6 weeks. So the contraction in output that occurred in the first 6 weeks of the COVID shutdown was 3 times greater than what happened in 3 years of the GFC in 2008. So a truly extraordinary collapse in economic activity and employment. But of course, things rebounded quickly, and we had a lot of stimulus. We had, you know, some miracle vaccines that came into deployment very quickly. And the result was that we got a significant boost in economic activity and excess demand. As Michael talked about, you know, think about your supply and demand curves. The demand curve shifted out and to the right, and the supply curve has shifted in and to the left. And the result of that is we've been migrating up that y-axis, which is the equilibrium price level. We call that process inflation, okay? And so what we're looking at here is, can you guys hear me if I step away a little bit? Okay. So what we're looking, okay. What we see here is nominal GDP growth in purple on a year-over-year basis. And the blue line is something we call aggregate payrolls. So the GDP number is a production measure, and we're showing it in nominal terms, and we're comparing that to an income measure, aggregate payrolls. So it's the number of employees at work, the number of hours they work in a given week, and average hourly earnings, all right? And normally we think about aggregate demand in real terms, but what's happened in the post-pandemic period is that the supply side of the economy has been unable to produce the quantity of goods and services that people want to consume. And so real GDP growth has been pretty weak in the last year, 18 months, but the excess demand is showing up on the price side, on nominal GDP. So you can see that there was this big spike in the rebound from the pandemic for both of these measures, but we're slowing down, particularly on the GDP side, that purple line, okay? But we're still running, if you look at the period 2018, 2019, before the pandemic, in nominal terms, the economy was growing about 4 to 5% per year. That was more of an equilibrium type pace, and we're still running quite a bit above that. So if we look at what's happening on the real side of the economy with a little bit more granular focus, you can see real GDP is shown in the purple bars for each quarter. This is annualized over the last couple of years. You can see that GDP in the first half of 2022 contracted in real terms, and then increased fairly healthy to a healthy extent in the second half of the year. But the GDP data that we get on a quarterly basis includes a lot of noise from categories like international trade, government consumption, inventory investment. These things tend to be a little bit noisy from quarter to quarter. And so what we're showing in blue is something it's called, kind of calling it core GDP, if you will, which is more the underlying trend in US domestic demand. So what this is private consumption and investment. So this is, household spending, business investment, fixed investment, residential investment. And you can see that that blue line has been slowing down quite a bit over the last couple of years, and that includes over the course of 2022. So it was positive in the first half when GDP was contracting. That's one of the reasons why we never really felt like the recession risk was particularly high this time last year, because the underlying trend was still pretty good, but it continues to slow down. So moving along to the labor market, we have, as Michael explained very well, serious demographic challenges, and the demand for labor is extremely robust. I know that's especially the case here in Utah. And one way to measure this imbalance in the labor market is the ratio of job openings to unemployed individuals that are actively looking for work. And you can see that before the pandemic, we had this significant decline during the GFC. It took a lot of years for the labor market to gradually heal. Some of that was through attrition because people were moving out of the labor force for retirement, other reasons. But finally, we ended the last cycle at a ratio of about 1.2, and we had an unemployment rate at 3.5% heading into COVID. And you can see in this rebound, we're now up to close to 2.0, two jobs available for every unemployed individual. So this is putting upward pressure on wages because, as we just heard earlier, companies are competing for a scarce pool of workers. So that's a very good story. The question is, why would we be talking about recession risk when demand for labor is so high? One thing to note, if we look at the long history of the unemployment rate, is that, again, we sit at 3.4 today on the far right side. That's the lowest in generations. But if you look historically, the gray shaded bars are recession periods, okay? And what you'll notice is that the unemployment rate tends to be at a cycle low, of course, just before recessions begin. There's often very little lag between the time the unemployment rate starts to tick up a little bit, like only 3 or 4 tenths, and when a recessionary period is defined. Usually recessions are kind of dated after the fact. It takes some time to gather the data gets revised. But in any case, the point is that looking at the level of unemployment is a little bit deceptive, okay? Because yes, the job market is very healthy, but that actually indicates that recession risk is higher on a go-forward basis than it would be if the unemployment rate were 5, 6, 7%, right? So let's talk about inflation. This, of course, was a huge driver of markets in the last year plus. And what you'll see here is 2 alternative measures of core inflation. So core inflation, whether CPI or something called PCE, the price deflator for personal consumption expenditures, core inflation strips out volatile categories, namely food and energy, not because we don't care what's happening to food and energy prices, which are very important, but because they introduce a lot of noise in the data. And so if we want to have a better sense of where inflation is likely heading, where it's trending, we want to strip out some of those noisier components. And so these are 2 alternative measures of core inflation, okay, for the CPI. They don't just strip out food and energy. What they do, the median CPI is what it sounds like. You could look at all the components of the CPI basket, and it shows the median in change from month to month, okay? And then you've also got something called trimmed mean, which is, instead of throwing out always food and energy, it ranks from highest to lowest the volatile components, and it tosses out, things that may be abnormally high or low in any given month. So what you'll see is on a year-over-year basis, as we all know, inflation has spiked in a way that we've not seen. This data only goes back just less than 40 years. So you would have to go back to the late 70s and early 80s to see something comparable to this. But there is some good news. And you can see here, if you look on a more high frequency basis, there's been a slowing of inflation across several important categories. This is showing 3-month annualized rate of change data. And we're breaking down the core CPI basket into 3 key components. And this is showing the contribution to the total year-over-year inflation number from each of the 3. All right, so let me give an example with the purple line here. This is core goods. This is, this is stuff that we consume on a day-to-day basis, aside from gasoline and energy. So you'll see back in early 2021, there was a real spike in core goods prices. That was used car prices rising, prices for other merchandise moving higher. And that reflected the supply chain bottlenecks, the chip shortage, and other problems associated with the reopening from the pandemic, right? We had this huge demand boost, ton of fiscal stimulus came into the economy, and the supply chains of the global economy couldn't keep up. So that was the transitory inflation spike, right? Well, look at what's happening now. That component is turning out to be transitory. And should we switch it? Okay. No, here, just keep this. Can you turn it off? Okay. So, okay. So you can see that core goods prices are falling now, at least in the last 3 months of data. And some of that is the strength of the dollar, some healing in global supply chains. And then if you look at the other 2 categories, the blue line is core services excluding shelter, and that's come down a bit. And then the gray line is the stickiest component, and that's shelter, the rent of shelter. So that includes people who pay rent, and also people who live in an owner-occupied home. The government imputes the rental inflation, right? They assume that even though you own the home, you are consuming a service in form of an imputed rent, right? That you would be paying if you were paying rent. So the issue with shelter inflation is that rents, leases don't turn over all at once, and so it takes time. There's a lag as market conditions that may change, have changed pretty quickly in the last year, as that feeds through into new leases, and over time that is going to bring down shelter inflation. So we're seeing some good news, but I think the Fed, we'll talk more about the Fed in just a minute. They are, they're concerned that we can't just count on, core goods prices falling. That's not going to happen forever. What if that reverses, right? We've already started to see used car prices tick up again. We've started to see the housing market pick up again. So we're going to talk now about where things are going. A lot of this is going to be framed around the Fed's objectives for the economy. And we'll talk a bit about fiscal policy too. So to begin, this is just a little diagram we put together to help think about what the Fed is trying to achieve, and sort of the process or the sequencing of bringing inflation under control. It's not enough just to bring inflation down to the 2% target. The Fed wants to have confidence that it's going to persist at 2%. Okay, and that's a little bit of a higher bar. So let's talk about what this involves. The Fed has 3 key policy tools. As Brandon mentioned, I had the opportunity to work at the New York Fed during the financial crisis. A lot of new tools were developed during that period as we were trying to both save the financial system and prevent the economy from contracting. And so today the Fed's operating with 3 main tools: changing the level of the Fed funds target rate, changing the size and composition of the balance sheet. Sometimes that's called quantitative easing on the way in, or quantitative tightening on the way out. And then you have forward guidance. So this is the Fed's guidance about what they expect to do in the future. Right? When the Fed tells you, when the Fed communicates to the public that they expect to raise interest rates at a faster pace in the future, or they expect to shrink the balance sheet in a way that's different, and the Fed is constantly getting market input. We speak to the Fed on a regular basis. We submit surveys every 6 weeks to them, and others do too. So they're trying to get input so that they use that to help shape their communication. If they feel like everybody's getting a little too bullish on the outlook and the Fed is worried that there's too much inflationary risk, they will shape that. They will use that to shape their forward guidance to sort of set the record straight. That's all intended to. This is a little bit sensitive here. Okay. Yes. We'll stay here for another minute. So that's all intended to tighten financial conditions, which is a fancy way of saying make asset prices go down. Okay, so we saw that happen last year. Bond prices went down because interest rates went up. Stock prices went down. The dollar went up, which actually has the same effect of restraining economic activity, and so on and so forth. That's intended to slow economic growth to a more moderate pace to bring demand for labor back down into a balance with supply. And that's sort of where we are in the process to this point. What we've not seen yet is an increase in labor market slack. Again, we have an unemployment rate at a cycle low, 3.4. We just had a booming payroll report for January last Friday. And then, so that needs to happen. And then the Fed wants that to happen so that we can bring wage growth down to more moderate levels. That is going to help to reduce cyclical inflation. So, you know, not every component of CPI is sensitive to the state of the labor market. So there's a limit to what the Fed can influence, but those are really the sectors the Fed wants to target. And then that is, again, the goal there is to control overall inflation. So let's talk, okay, good. Let's talk about what the market is expecting for the end of this hiking cycle to look like. The Fed has obviously hiked rates very aggressively. We've got a Fed funds target rate up close to 4 3/4. And if we look at the upcoming year, the calendar for FOMC meetings, this is what we see. Let me explain to you this. The purple bars show the basis point increases or change in the Fed funds target rate that the market is pricing in, okay? So at the upcoming March 22nd meeting on the left, the market is priced for 27 basis points increase in the Fed funds target. So 25 plus some small chance that they would do a little bit more, okay? And you can see going forward. So market's anticipating a hike in March and another in May of basically 25 basis points. And then some high chance that they will wind the hiking cycle down. That would put us at about a target rate of 5 to 5 1/4. We would call that the terminal rate if that's where they stop. That's what we expect to happen. 2 more hikes in March and in May. And then you can see as you go forward in the year, the market is pricing in a decline in rates. We don't think it's going to be that quick to see rate cuts, but it makes sense that the market would price in this kind of probability weighted scenario, because if the labor market rolls over, if there's some other exogenous shock, then the Fed could pivot from rate hikes to rate cuts. Okay, so that's where we see the Fed ending up somewhere around 5 1/4% at the end of the hiking cycle, and probably delaying the start of interest rate cuts to the end of this year, maybe even earlier in 2024, because the Fed really wants to see unemployment rate rising and then holding rates at a high level, even as the economy is contracting. This is very different from the Fed's, what we call the reaction function that we've seen from the Fed in really, at least my lifetime. Okay, so let's go forward here to talk a little bit more about the recession dynamic and the things that we look at in making that assessment. So here you can see a survey that's taken on a quarterly basis from the Philadelphia Fed. They ask professional forecasters, a whole range of questions, including what's the probability you see of a contraction in real GDP in 4 quarters time. You'll see that most of the time, even around recessionary periods, if you can see the shaded bars, recession probability is deemed to be pretty low, right? Historically, something in a 25 to 30% type range is viewed to be fairly high recession risk within a year. This is different. In data we have since the late 1960s, we've never seen a spike in concerns among professional forecasters for looming recession. So that I think is notable in and of itself, and it speaks to, in part, what the Fed is trying to achieve, right? Trying to squeeze inflation out of the system. So our own view, as you can see here, this is a probability model that we've developed, and we track this over time. You can see over a 6-month horizon or a 12-month horizon, the model implied recession probability. So as we have data as of the fourth quarter, you can see in Q4, the 6-month and the 12-month recession probabilities moved higher. So, you know, this is not ironclad, but it does give us, among other signals, some confidence that recession risk is high. So we'll talk more about the Fed's forecast and how this feeds into it. I talked about how the Fed's goal is to see the labor market loosen. And one way to measure that is looking at, you know, the Fed releases on a quarterly basis their own projections for several economic variables, including the unemployment rate. So you can see this is as of December, the last forecast they've given us. This will be updated in March, mid-March. But what you'll see is, let me draw your attention to the blue line, okay? This is the increase in the unemployment rate that is implied in the Fed's forecast. The purple data is the historical data here shows the increase in the unemployment rate from the trailing trough. So right now we're at a 3.4% unemployment rate. The Fed as of December envisioned going to 4.6 at the end of this year. That 1.1 percentage point increase is indicated in the horizontal red line. So you can see how that compares to history. And what you'll see, again, if you trace that back to the left, that every time the unemployment rate has risen by a percentage point or even less, that's always happened when we're in a recession. So this you know, implies to us that even though the Fed doesn't really come out, they certainly don't come out and say, we want to push the economy into a downturn so that we can control inflation. It's pretty clear that that is the way they're thinking about this situation. Okay, what does the data tell us about, you know, prospects for a turn in the labor market? The backward-looking data is phenomenally strong, but on a go-forward basis, there's a bit more cause for concern. So, you know, this is one way to gauge the balance of risks for the unemployment rate, and that is looking at the leading economic index. That itself contains 10 different indicators that tend to, you know, move down or move up in advance of turns in the broader business cycle, right? These are things like housing starts, the shape of the yield curve, manufacturing, that tend to be first movers when the economy is decelerating. And then typically the labor market and inflation will often move later in the cycle. So the LEI, as we call it, if you look at the change over the last 6 months, that's where we see the purple line here on the right-hand side. That's moved well into contraction territory. In the data we have for the last 50 years, we've never had that kind of drop in the LEI that hasn't ended in a recession. Now, that we've made a lot of firsts, we've broken a lot of models, if you will, in the last few years with this pandemic. So again, there's no certainty in this business, but it does suggest that we're likely to see the unemployment rate rise. That the blue line is the unemployment rate change on an inverted scale on the right-hand side. So a drop in that blue line, if it does materialize, would be pointing to an unemployment rate increase. Okay? Okay, so one other aspect of the outlook, and then I'll wrap up with some comments on the market outlook, is the upcoming debt limit fight. We're now living in divided government after the midterms, which saw Republicans take control of the House. And so I think there is a risk. We talk a lot about monetary policy tightening. I glossed over the fact that the Fed is, you know, shrinking its holdings of treasuries and mortgages, and that's going to continue, I think, for some time. But the fiscal side of the equation is really important. So I think the key thing to be watching for is of course the debt limit, which needs to be increased. We're in what's called a debt issuance suspension period. The Treasury is using extraordinary measures, which means that, you know, we're kind of fiddling with government accounting to allow the Treasury to continue to raise new debt in the market and to run a deficit, which is, you know, on a run rate basis about 5% of GDP, just about $1.2 trillion on an annual basis. And so we're in this period where the Treasury has some room for maneuver and that's going to run out probably around mid-year. Okay, so when that time, when the clock runs out and the Treasury exhausts its cash balance and some of these accounting tricks that it can use, at that point we're going to need to see the debt limit increase, or we're going to have to run a balanced budget immediately. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of negotiating. You saw some of it taking place on live TV if you watched the State of the Union address earlier this week. So we'll see where that leads, but it's clear that the Republicans, this is one of the few points of leverage they have in Washington, and so they're going to use it to try to extract some concessions on spending from the Biden administration. But of course, Democrats in the Senate and the Biden White House, want a clean debt limit increase with no strings attached. So I think this will probably go down to the wire. There is a mechanism by which the Treasury, in conjunction with the Fed, can continue to make payments on U.S. debt obligations without a default, right? So we're bringing in money, the Treasury is bringing in money, they put that money all goes in and out of their account at the Federal Reserve. And so there is, in theory, a process to make Treasury payments on Treasury securities before anything else, so that we don't have a default on our debt. But that's never been tested. And we don't know quite how that would work. We don't know how the market would react to it. And even if they did do that and we went past this sort of what's called drop dead date, again, we would have to cut the budget deficit, which you can see on the right. This is the federal deficit as a percent of GDP. That sits about 5%. That would be a really massive fiscal tightening to happen in a short period of time if it came to that. Right. So, okay, with that, we're going to talk a bit about our thoughts on the market and how this ties in together with what we're doing for our client portfolios. And let me start, we talked about some of the recession forecasting tools that we have. But again, forecasting a recession is good. It's interesting. It's something that clients want to talk about. But at the end of the day, what we have to do is make investment decisions. What do we do with our interest rate exposure, our duration position? What do we think about movements in the shape of the yield curve? How much credit exposure do we want? What industries do we want to favor or avoid? What's our view on the equity market or on currency markets and commodities and real estate? So one of the tools that we've developed about 5 years ago on my team to complement the recession forecasting work is an asset allocation model, and we call it the bull bear market indicator. I won't bore you with the gory details or the math behind it, but what you see on the top is a mean reverting indicator. Okay, this is a composite of several different economic data points, right? What is the shape of the yield curve? Is it steep? Is it flat? What's the level of the unemployment rate? These things tend to be pretty clear. These tend to contain pretty clear messages when you're at the end of an expansion. And so we combine them. So long story short here is when this indicator falls below the red line up on the top, that triggers the beginning for us of a more defensive posture on asset allocation, right? And then when you go through a downturn and the indicator moves back up, that triggers the start of a new bull market regime. So we think about the opportunities of stocks versus bonds or high risk versus low risk. And so on the bottom, this is a bit of a proof of concept. We actually have this data going back to the 1960s, but you'll see kind of how it works. So on the bottom panel, what this is showing on a log scale. So, every time you cross an axis line, you're doubling. But when that line goes up, that tells you that the stock market, the S&P 500, is outperforming the bond market, right? A corporate bond index. So it's sort of a risk on or risk off metric, okay? And so you'll see that the green shaded areas align with our bull market regimes from the macro indicator. And generally speaking, you see that line moving up in bull markets, which is what you would expect. And then in the bear markets, which are this sort of reddish shading, that means that the stock market is underperforming the bond market, right? And so that was certainly the case in 2000, 2001, again, during the GFC, and then during COVID. That doesn't mean that you can't see periods of really strong performance in stocks or risky assets. 2019 is a great example. The S&P was up 30% in that year. The NASDAQ was up 40%. But for the duration of that signal period, you would have been better to be in a safer asset, even cash or high quality bonds relative to stocks, okay, until the signal flipped. So this is, among other things, has us in a bit more of a defensive posture when we manage our portfolios. And again, much of what we do is invest in fixed income portfolios for our clients. Last year was really a tough year. The biggest decline in the bond index that we've seen in many decades. So very painful. But what you'll see here is that the good news for if you're a bond investor, maybe if you're a bank as well, is that there's income in fixed income again, all right, thanks to Jay Powell and the FOMC. And so what we're showing is the relationship between the yield on the index at the start of the year, the bond index, that's shown from left to right here horizontally. And what we find is the higher the yield at the beginning of the year, on average, the higher the return tends to be. And that's sort of an intuitive relationship because over a long period of time, most of what you earn in your bond portfolio is the coupon or the yield. And so if there's a silver lining of around last year's sell-off, it's that the opportunity in fixed income is attractive. We hear this from a lot of investors that are happy to take a little bit less risk overall by being in something a little bit more conservative and get paid for that. We get often, we have very deep expertise in corporate credit and structured credit markets as well. So we're very attentive to the risk, of increasing corporate defaults. These things tend to happen during a downturn. What we find here, this is showing the net interest expense of all American non-financial corporate businesses as a percentage of their total output, right, or revenue as a proxy. And what's remarkable is how much this has declined in the last 10 plus years since the financial crisis. So this doesn't look like a very stressful period for American businesses if you look just based on debt service. And that's because they've been able to take advantage of the environment of low rates that persisted for a long time and term out their debt and accumulate large holdings of cash and other assets that help to offset the interest burden of rising interest rates. So this gives us some comfort that, again, from a fixed income portfolio standpoint, we're not overly concerned that this is going to be a real ugly default cycle for businesses in the United States. So, okay, one more chart here on the housing market, and then happy to take some questions. Hopefully this has prompted some questions, some interest. So this is, I think, it's been a wild ride for the housing market in the last few years, a real boom bust period, and a lot of that driven by what's happening with interest rates. We're pretty sanguine on the outlook for residential real estate, for housing overall. We feel pretty good. And the key reason is that housing fundamentals look very different than they did the last time we saw a dip in housing prices, starting in 2006. Okay, then we had a lot of overbuilding. We had a lot of concern. There were a lot of problems with mortgage underwriting and the whole value chain in housing and mortgage finance. There were a lot of weaknesses, which have been cleaned up to a significant extent after the financial crisis. So a couple of measures that we're tracking here. In the purple line on the left-hand side of the chart shows us the vacancy rate for single-family homes. So this is the percentage of the entire housing stock nationwide that is sitting empty. Okay, maybe it has a for sale sign, and that ratio is sitting at the lowest levels we've seen in about 45 years. We just have not been building enough homes, and I know this has been a huge problem in Utah. We've not been building enough homes to meet the demand, and so that's put that vacancy rate on a downward trajectory to, kind of a practical low, right, that you could expect. The blue line on the right-hand scale shows us the kind of a measure of the aggregate LTV, or loan to value. So it takes the entire outstanding mortgage amount for all mortgage borrowers and divides that by the total value of the residential housing stock. Now, not every homeowner has a mortgage, so it's not a purely apples to apples comparison. But what you can see is the blue line here down at 30%. What this means is that even though mortgage credit in aggregate has risen a bit, since the pandemic, the value of residential real estate has been growing to a greater extent. So the housing market is being deleveraged every day in the aggregate. All right. So I think it's, even though the Fed has throttled back demand for housing with the big increase in mortgage rates, overall, we feel pretty good that the fundamentals for housing are fairly solid. So anyway, that's all I had prepared, but I think we have time for a couple of questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to speak up. Yeah, so anticipated rate hikes. That data comes from the swap market. So there is an interest rate swap market. We call it OIS market, overnight index swap. So basically what it is you have two counterparties. One agrees to receive a floating leg, one agrees to pay a floating leg based on the effective federal funds rate for a defined period of time. So, you can actually trade. It's similar to Fed funds futures, if anyone's familiar. So you can actually trade a swap that says, okay, the market is pricing in 20 basis points of hikes for the May meeting. I think they're going to do 25. So I'm going to pay that fixed rate on the swap. And if they deliver 25, then I'll earn 5 basis points when it's all said and done. Okay, so that's the source. It comes from Bloomberg, but it allows us to really look on a very granular basis exactly what's priced into the swap curve for each and every upcoming FOMC meeting.
Do you have a feeling that will increase PayPal's aptitude or ability for a soft landing? And then also go along with that, do you have faith in him holding strong and not coming off too weak like it did the inflation come on?
Yeah, both great questions. So I do think that the Fed has been encouraged by the recent data, the strength of the job market, but particularly we've seen a bit of moderation in wages. So I didn't show that particular data set, but we have seen several indications in the last 3 to 6 months that wages have started to cool, even though the unemployment rate keeps going down. And so that would, if that persists, that would be a very encouraging sign, right? The inflation data is cooling off. Some of the wage indicators are coming down. The question is, can that wage trend come all the way back to where the Fed wants to see it without the unemployment rate rising, without a recession? We don't think that is going to be the case. We think if the job market continues to be hot, unemployment rate is going to have continue to fall. That's going to keep wages and underlying inflation above the level the Fed is comfortable with. And that's going to make them concerned about the point that you raised about what happened in the 70s. It took a process of 15 years from the late 60s to 1983 to see inflation convincingly move down. And in the process, guess how much the unemployment rate moved up in 3 ratcheting cycles? 10 percentage points. Okay, people talked about stagflation. That's why, because unemployment moved up, and then you go through a downturn, and the Fed would, relent, and then unemployment rate would rise with inflation. And over the course of that period of time, 10-year Treasury yields increased by also 12 percentage points, actually. So that's what it took to finally conquer inflation. I don't think we're looking at that severe a problem, but I do think that Powell has kind of an extra burden on his shoulders because people, when the history books are written, people are going to remember Jay Powell, and more so than Lael Brainerd or Christopher Waller or John Williams, all these other people who play an important role in the policy discussion. it's going to be on him or whoever may succeed him in time as to whether they finish the job. So I've been surprised, honestly, that they've kind of backed off in the last couple of months. I think Powell missed an opportunity at the recent FOMC meeting to hike by 50 basis points. I think that would have been a smarter move. And he's also given the markets a little bit of room for optimism. I think that's to me I think that's tricky because I don't think we can be confident that the job is done just yet. So we'll see how they handle it. Anybody else? We may have time for one more. Yeah.
Earlier on,
Yeah.
Indicated that the Fed still has some leverage or some tricks up their sleeve that they can use if we don't fall into debt. Doesn't that really affect the economy as been banning in all of our hearts? That this is going to really cripple our economy and fail to meet and pay our debts.
Absolutely. I think that's a key risk. It raises uncertainty among individuals and families. It raises uncertainty for businesses, for our trade partners, and for the markets. So I think we probably will go down to the wire, partly because both sides of the political aisle feel like they have something they can gain out of this battle, to be honest. I think the Democrats relish, calling the Republicans, crazy, arsonists, and Republicans like calling Democrats, big spenders, right, that have caused a lot of inflation. So to a certain extent, both sides, I think, are going to kind of drag this out, unfortunately. But okay, good. I think we may be done, but I'll stick around down here if there's any more. Thank you so much.
Well, truly, we live in unprecedented times, and I'm so thankful for Michael and Miles and Brian for helping us understand this. Let's give them another round of applause. I'm very thankful for all your support of Bank of Utah. I'm being thankful for the Ogden Weaver Chamber of Commerce, Weaver State University for partnering with us on this event, and thank all of you for being here this day.